Rain had fallen over Manhattan for 11 straight days, a thin gray drizzle that clung to the glass towers of Langford Furnishings like a held breath. Inside the corporate headquarters, on the 32nd floor, the air felt heavier than the weather outside, because the company was preparing for the largest merger in its history, a deal worth several $billions that would either save the family business or destroy what remained of it. Malcolm Carter did not think about billion-dollar mergers. He thought about broken air conditioning units, flickering hallway lights, and the small daily miracle of keeping an aging building running smoothly for nearly 2,000 employees who barely noticed his existence until something stopped working. At 39 years old, Malcolm carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived the worst thing life could throw at him, and everything after that felt survivable by comparison. He was the head of building maintenance, a role most people in tailored suits walked past without a second glance, yet somehow he was the one person on that floor who could make an entire room forget its stress for 30 seconds at a time. Few of his coworkers knew that Malcolm had been a widower for many years, that his wife had passed away suddenly during what should have been the happiest chapter of his life, and that the quiet, patient version of himself they saw every day had been rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, out of a grief that once nearly swallowed him whole. He rarely spoke of that period, choosing instead to let his humor fill the space where sorrow used to live, and those who worked closely with him sensed there was history behind his calm, without ever asking what it was. That Thursday afternoon, the tension inside the office had reached a breaking point no joke could easily cut through. Analysts had been locked in conference rooms since morning. The merger committee had rejected 2 proposals in a row, and rumors were already spreading that the board wanted answers nobody had ready. Malcolm walked the main hallway, pushing a small cart of replacement bulbs, humming under his breath, doing what he always did best, turning dread into something people could breathe through. He cracked a joke about the coffee machine being the only thing in the building more temperamental than the stock market, and a cluster of junior employees laughed harder than the joke deserved, the way people laugh when they desperately need permission to release pressure. It was in that exact moment, surrounded by nervous laughter, that Victoria Langford turned the corner. Victoria was 37 years old, and she moved through her own hallways the way a queen moves through a court that has never fully accepted her crown. She had inherited the company from her father, a beloved patriarch whose easy charm she had never quite managed to replicate, and the board never let her forget it. Every decision she made was scrutinized twice as hard, every mistake magnified, every silence read as evidence that a woman alone could not hold together what generations of men had built. She was beautiful in the distant, untouchable way of magazine covers, brilliant in the exhausting way of someone who has to prove it daily, and famously, unmistakably cold. Nobody at Langford Furnishings could remember the last time they had seen Victoria smile, let alone laugh, and most employees had quietly accepted that whatever warmth she once possessed had been spent years ago on people who were no longer around to receive it. She was walking fast that afternoon, papers in hand, headed toward yet another meeting, meant to convince skeptical board members that she still deserved to run the empire bearing her name. She barely registered the cluster of laughing employees until she was almost past them, and it was Malcolm's voice, easy and unbothered by rank, that pulled her attention sideways. Still riding the momentum of his own joke, feeling bold in the way tired, overworked people sometimes feel bold, he turned toward her with a grin and said the words that would upend both their lives. "If you're still not married, Victoria, maybe you should just marry me." The hallway went silent for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of silence that feels louder than noise, before it broke into nervous, disbelieving laughter. Junior employees covered their mouths. Someone near the printer actually gasped. Nobody in that building had ever spoken to Victoria Langford like that, half joking, half fearless, treating her not as an icon behind glass, but as a person who might actually laugh at a bad joke like anyone else. Malcolm himself felt a flicker of panic the instant the words left his mouth, the sudden, cold realization that maybe humor had limits he had just crossed. Victoria did not laugh. She did not smile. She simply stopped walking, turned her head, and looked directly at him for a long, unreadable moment that seemed to stretch far past what a joke deserved. Then, in a voice so calm, it silenced the entire hallway, she said two words that nobody expected. Follow me. For a brief moment, nobody in that hallway moved, as though the entire floor was waiting to see whether Malcolm would actually obey a command that sounded more like the opening line of a dismissal than an invitation to anything pleasant. Someone near the supply closet whispered that he was finished, that no one spoke to Victoria Langford the way he just had, and kept a paycheck afterward, and a few heads nodded in solemn agreement. Malcolm heard fragments of the whispering as he set down his cart, and even though his stomach had folded into a tight, cold knot, he refused to let his face show it, walking after her with the same steady calm he brought to every difficult repair job, the kind of calm that had carried him through far worse mornings than this one. She turned and walked toward the private elevator without waiting to see if he obeyed, without offering a single word of explanation, her heels striking the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. Malcolm stood frozen for a heartbeat, aware that every eye on the floor was now fixed on him, aware that whatever happened next would be retold in break rooms for weeks. He set down his cart, exhaled once, and followed her, telling himself this was simply the moment his employment at Langford Furnishings quietly ended. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt endless, silence pressing against Malcolm's ears louder than any argument could have. Victoria stood with her back straight, eyes fixed on the numbers climbing above the door, giving him nothing to read, no anger, no amusement, nothing at all. Malcolm ran through every possible outcome in his head, rehearsed apologies, imagined security escorting him out with his belongings in a cardboard box, imagined explaining to his landlord why his paycheck would stop coming. Employees on the lower floors had already begun whispering by the time the elevator doors closed, phones lighting up with hushed messages asking what exactly had just happened between the maintenance chief and the CEO. Nobody had an answer, only the unsettling fact that Victoria Langford had personally, wordlessly, pulled a maintenance worker away from his shift in front of half the office. The doors finally opened onto the private penthouse level, a space few employees had ever seen, all soft lighting, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows fogged faintly with the day's rain. Victoria walked without hesitation toward a closed door near the far end of the hallway, and when she opened it, Malcolm realized with a jolt that it was her bedroom, spare and elegant, more disciplined than luxurious, nothing like the excess he might have imagined for someone of her wealth. She stepped inside and waited for him to follow, and once he crossed the threshold, she reached back and turned the lock with a soft, deliberate click that echoed far louder than it should have in the quiet room. Malcolm stood near the doorway, hands loosely at his sides, heart pounding with a confusion he could not name, caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. Victoria studied him for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice quieter now, stripped of the executive edge she wore like armor downstairs. "What exactly did you say to me back there?" Malcolm swallowed hard, already assembling an apology in his mind, already certain this conversation would end with him clearing out his locker. He told her he was sorry, that it was a joke, a stupid attempt to lighten the mood after a long, stressful week, that he never meant any disrespect toward her or her position. He explained that people on his team had been anxious all day, that humor was simply the tool he reached for instinctively, the way some men reach for anger and others reach for silence. He told her he understood if this meant the end of his job, that he would pack his things quietly and leave without making a scene. He finished speaking and braced himself, certain the worst was coming. Instead, Victoria said one word. "Repeat it." Malcolm blinked, certain he had misheard her, but her expression remained fixed, patient, waiting. Reluctantly, feeling like a man walking backward into a trap he could not see, he repeated the joke almost exactly as he had said it in the hallway, his voice smaller this time, stripped of its earlier confidence. Victoria listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face, and when he finished, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though confirming something she had already suspected. The silence that followed felt different from before, less threatening, heavier with meaning Malcolm could not decipher. "This isn't the first time I've heard those words," she finally said. Victoria walked slowly to the window, looking out over the rain-streaked skyline of the city her family had built its fortune upon, and began to speak in a voice that sounded, for the first time Malcolm had ever heard, genuinely vulnerable. She told him about 5 years earlier, a period almost nobody at the company remembered clearly now, when Langford Furnishings had stood on the edge of total collapse, drowning in debt her father had quietly accumulated before his death. She had been 32 years old then, freshly thrust into leadership, terrified every single day that she would be the generation that lost everything her family had spent decades building. She told him that during the darkest week of that crisis, exhausted and half convinced she would have to file for bankruptcy, she had walked into a small coffee shop near the old downtown offices, desperate simply to be anonymous for 10 minutes. A stranger had been sitting near the window that day, she continued, a man she never learned the name of, who noticed she was fighting back tears over a cooling cup of coffee. He said very little, she recalled, but before he left, he told her something she had never forgotten in 5 years, a strange, offhand piece of comfort that somehow lodged itself permanently in her memory. If you ever lose everything, he told her, marry the person who can still make you laugh. Victoria turned from the window to face Malcolm directly, watching the recognition slowly dawn across his features, watching him connect 2 moments separated by half a decade and an entire lifetime of circumstance. Malcolm felt something cold move through his chest as pieces clicked into place he had never thought to examine before. A fragment of memory, surfacing from a period of his life he barely let himself think about anymore. He remembered, faintly, a small coffee shop, a stressed young woman by the window, a conversation he had considered forgettable at the time, offered without any expectation it would matter to anyone later. He had said those words once, years ago, to a stranger whose face had long since blurred in his memory, never imagining she was the same woman now standing before him as his employer. "You don't actually remember me, do you?" Victoria said quietly, and it was not quite a question. Malcolm admitted honestly that he did not, that the encounter had faded into the general blur of ordinary days from years earlier, that he had no idea the stranger from that coffee shop and the CEO standing before him were the same person until this very conversation. Victoria absorbed this without visible disappointment, only a kind of tired understanding, the look of someone who had built an entire private memory around a moment the other person had simply lived through and moved on from. She told him that encounter had stayed with her every difficult year since, that it was, strangely, the only time in that entire crisis she had genuinely laughed, however briefly, however unexpectedly. She explained that when he repeated nearly the same sentiment in the hallway that afternoon, joking and careless, something in her chest had simply refused to let the moment pass unexamined again. That single revelation was enough to end their conversation for the day, but it was nowhere near enough to end Victoria's curiosity about the man in front of her. She began watching him differently after that afternoon, no longer simply as building staff moving unnoticed through her hallways, but as a person whose history clearly ran deeper than his job title suggested. Word of the strange encounter naturally spread through the office, despite neither of them saying a public word about it, and it did not take long before Daniel Rhodes, the company's ambitious vice president, decided the story was worth investigating for reasons entirely his own. Daniel had spent years positioning himself as the natural successor to Victoria's father, quietly building alliances with board members who already doubted whether a woman without an MBA truly belonged at the head of a corporation this size. He had joined the company nearly a decade earlier under her father's mentorship, learning the family patriarch's habits and preferences so thoroughly that many senior executives privately assumed he would eventually take over the company himself, an assumption Daniel had done nothing to discourage over the years. When Victoria inherited the position instead of him, he had smiled graciously in public, while quietly nursing a resentment that had only deepened with every quarter she managed to keep the company afloat. Despite the board's persistent doubts, he saw Victoria's strange, sudden interest in a maintenance worker as either a scandal waiting to be exposed or a distraction that would weaken her standing before the merger vote, and either outcome suited his ambitions perfectly. He assigned a private research contact to dig quietly into Malcolm Carter's background, expecting to find nothing more than an unremarkable employment history, a man who fixed leaking pipes and burnt out light fixtures for a living. What his contact uncovered, instead, left even Daniel momentarily stunned, forcing him to reconsider the entire situation from a different, more dangerous angle. Malcolm Carter, it turned out, had once been one of the most promising young architects in the city, a graduate of a prestigious design program who had, in his late 20s, contributed to several award-winning commercial projects that still stood proudly along the skyline. Colleagues from that era described him as brilliant, meticulous, and endlessly patient with difficult clients, a man clearly destined for a distinguished career at the top of his field. Then, according to the sparse and carefully worded records Daniel's contact managed to find, Malcolm had simply vanished from the profession, entirely following what those records vaguely called a personal tragedy, never explaining himself to former colleagues, never taking another design job again. He had reappeared years later as a maintenance supervisor at Langford Furnishings, a role wildly beneath his training, seemingly by deliberate choice rather than misfortune. Meanwhile, unaware of Daniel's growing file on him, Malcolm found himself spending unexpected pockets of time with Victoria over the following weeks, brief conversations in the elevator that gradually stretched into longer discussions after hours. She began seeking him out when problems arose that had nothing to do with plumbing or electrical wiring, drawn by the way he approached complicated issues with a calm, structural clarity that none of her expensive consultants ever managed. When the merger negotiations stalled over disagreements about redesigning 3 flagship retail locations, it was Malcolm, almost by accident, who offered a perspective that reframed the entire proposal in a single afternoon conversation. Victoria began to realize that the man she had once dismissed as simply likable was quietly one of the sharpest minds she had encountered in years, and that realization only deepened her curiosity about the tragedy that had driven him away from architecture in the first place. It was during one such conversation, held late in her office after most employees had gone home, that Daniel appeared unannounced, holding a thin folder he clearly intended to use as leverage. He mentioned, with feigned casualness, that he had come across some old documents referencing a Malcolm Carter, a name he found curious given the maintenance chief's current position, and he asked Victoria pointedly whether she was aware of her employee's complicated professional past. Victoria kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give Daniel the satisfaction of visible surprise, though internally she felt the walls of a private discovery suddenly threatened by outside eyes. Daniel left the folder on her desk without elaborating further, offering only a thin, knowing smile before departing, a smile that told her clearly this was only the opening move of something larger he intended to pursue. Daniel wasted no time turning his discovery into strategy. Once he sensed an opportunity forming, he met privately with 3 sympathetic board members over dinner, framing the story not as harmless curiosity, but as evidence that Victoria's judgment could not be trusted during the most sensitive negotiation period in company history. He suggested, carefully and without ever stating it outright, that a CEO who summoned a subordinate to her private bedroom over an offhand joke was exhibiting exactly the kind of erratic behavior the merger's outside investors would find deeply troubling. The board members, already primed by years of quiet doubt about Victoria's leadership, listened with the eager attention of people who had been waiting for permission to act on suspicions they already held. Within days, carefully worded rumors began circulating through financial circles about impropriety at Langford Furnishings, vague enough to avoid direct accusation, but damaging enough to raise uncomfortable questions among investors watching the merger closely. A financial reporter with connections inside the board picked up fragments of the story and published a brief, speculative piece questioning Victoria's judgment during a critical business period, careful never to state anything as fact, but insinuating plenty. The company's stock dipped noticeably within 48 hours of publication, a small but symbolically painful blow at the exact moment stability mattered most to nervous shareholders. Pressure mounted quickly after that, board members who had once stayed quiet suddenly finding their voices, murmuring that perhaps it was time to discuss alternative leadership before the merger vote finalized anything irreversible. Victoria found herself cornered in a way she had not experienced even during the darkest days of the original financial crisis 5 years earlier. Watching allies, she thought she could count on grow suddenly distant and non-committal. An emergency board session was scheduled within the week, specifically to discuss what several members euphemistically called leadership continuity concerns, a phrase everyone in the building understood to mean they intended to push her out before the merger closed. Malcolm learned of the brewing crisis from Emily Ross, Victoria's longtime assistant, who had grown fond enough of him over recent weeks to warn him quietly rather than let him discover the situation secondhand. Guilt settled heavily over Malcolm once he understood the scale of what his careless hallway joke had unintentionally set into motion. He spent that entire night awake, replaying every conversation with Victoria, every private admission she had made about the coffee shop, and the stranger, and the years she had carried that memory alone. He thought about the architecture career he had abandoned, the reasons buried beneath years of deliberate silence, and the quiet, unremarkable life he had built specifically to avoid ever being seen too closely by anyone again. He thought about his late wife, about how she had once told him that his gift for solving impossible structural problems was wasted if he only ever used it to avoid being noticed, and how she had always believed he would eventually find his way back to work that mattered, even if he never returned to architecture exactly as it once was. He thought about the years he had spent hiding in plain sight, content to be underestimated, because being underestimated felt safer than being seen and possibly failing again the way he once had. By sunrise, something in him had shifted, a decision forming with the same steady clarity he once brought to complex building designs years earlier. If Victoria was going to lose everything because of a moment he had started, however innocently, then he owed her more than silent guilt from the maintenance closet downstairs. The emergency board meeting convened in the largest conference room on the top floor, board members seated around a long glass table with Daniel positioned confidently near the head, clearly expecting to guide the conversation toward Victoria's removal. Victoria sat composed despite the mounting pressure, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of visible desperation, though everyone in the room understood how precarious her position had become. Just as Daniel began outlining his prepared case against her leadership, the door opened unannounced, and Malcolm Carter walked in wearing his maintenance uniform, carrying nothing but a single folder and an expression of complete calm. Several board members exchanged confused glances, unsure why building staff had wandered into a confidential executive session, while Daniel's expression flickered briefly with something close to alarm, before settling back into practiced composure. Malcolm apologized for the interruption, but asked, respectfully and firmly, for exactly 10 minutes to address concerns he understood were currently being discussed about the company's stability. Victoria said nothing, watching him with an unreadable expression, while the board chairman, more out of curiosity than courtesy, gestured for him to proceed. Malcolm opened his folder and began speaking, and within moments the entire tone of the room shifted from dismissive tolerance to genuine, startled attention. He walked the board through a detailed structural analysis of the 3 flagship locations at the center of the merger dispute, explaining precisely why the proposed renovation budget had been miscalculated by nearly 40%, due to outdated engineering assumptions baked into the original blueprints. He identified specific load-bearing miscalculations that would have caused costly delays midway through construction, delays that would have embarrassed the company publicly during the exact quarter the merger needed to demonstrate stability to nervous investors. Several board members who had spent decades in commercial real estate found themselves nodding along despite their initial skepticism, recognizing genuine expertise when they finally saw it. He continued, methodically, connecting the renovation miscalculations to a pattern of unusual budget approvals that had passed through Daniel's office over the previous 18 months, numbers that consistently favored one particular external contractor with ties, Malcolm noted carefully, to a company Daniel's brother-in-law partially owned. The room grew noticeably quieter as Malcolm laid out dates, figures, and approval signatures with the same calm precision he had once used presenting architectural proposals to skeptical clients years earlier. Daniel's composure finally cracked, his voice rising as he accused Malcolm of fabricating evidence and overstepping boundaries no maintenance worker had any right to cross. Malcolm remained unshaken, sliding copies of the documentation across the table toward the board chairman, inviting anyone present to verify the figures independently rather than simply take his word for it. The chairman spent several long minutes reviewing the documents in silence, while the rest of the room waited, tension thick enough that nobody dared speak. Finally, he looked up, first at Daniel, then at Victoria, and asked the vice president directly whether he could explain the contractor relationship Malcolm had just described in such specific detail. Daniel attempted an explanation that grew increasingly tangled the longer he spoke, contradicting himself twice within a single sentence. The confidence that had carried him through years of boardroom politics finally failing him under direct scrutiny. Board members who moments earlier had been prepared to remove Victoria from leadership now found themselves questioning an entirely different executive's integrity instead. Over the following hour, the full picture emerged with painful clarity for everyone present. Daniel had systematically funneled renovation contracts toward a company secretly connected to his own family for over a year, inflating costs and quietly pocketing a percentage through an arrangement so carefully hidden that even the company's internal auditors had missed it entirely. The recent rumors targeting Victoria's judgment, the board eventually realized, had been a deliberate distraction engineered to draw attention away from Daniel's own financial misconduct at precisely the moment external investors were scrutinizing every account most closely. Security was called before the meeting concluded, and Daniel was escorted from the building that same afternoon, his years of careful political maneuvering collapsing within the span of a single conversation. Victoria remained silent through most of the unfolding revelation, watching the man she had once dismissed as simply the building's maintenance chief dismantle a conspiracy that would have ended her career within a single, confident hour. She thought back to every quiet doubt she had carried about her own competence over the past 5 years, every meeting where she had wondered whether the board's skepticism about her leadership might actually be justified, and felt something loosen inside her chest, as she realized the greatest threat to her position had never truly been her own inexperience at all, but a colleague's carefully hidden greed dressed up as concern for the company's welfare. When the board chairman finally turned to her, offering something close to an apology for how quickly they had been prepared to believe the worst about her leadership, Victoria simply nodded, her attention still fixed on Malcolm across the table. After the room emptied and only the two of them remained, she asked him quietly why he had done it, why he had risked exposing his entire hidden history rather than simply letting the situation resolve itself without him. Malcolm told her honestly that he had never wanted recognition or a promotion, that he had spent years deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of visibility, because visibility, in his experience, tended to invite the kind of scrutiny that had once cost him everything he loved. He explained that he had only stepped forward because he could not stand by and watch a mistake he had unintentionally set in motion destroy someone who had shown him, in her own careful way, more genuine curiosity about who he actually was than almost anyone in years. Victoria studied him for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind her eyes, and for the first time since anyone at the company could remember, she smiled. Not the practiced, professional smile she offered investors, but something unguarded and real. Word of that smile spread through the office faster than any merger announcement ever could, employees whispering to one another that whatever had happened in that boardroom, their CEO had finally, genuinely smiled in front of people again. In the days that followed, with Daniel gone and the merger conspiracy fully exposed, Victoria found a quiet moment to ask Malcolm the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since that very first afternoon in her office. She reminded him of the joke that had started everything, the careless proposal tossed out in a crowded hallway weeks earlier, and asked, with more vulnerability in her voice than he had ever heard from her, whether it had truly meant nothing at all. Malcolm hesitated before answering, choosing his words with the same careful precision he brought to structural calculations, telling her honestly that what began as a joke had, somewhere along the way, stopped feeling like one entirely. He admitted that he had begun to notice things about her that had nothing to do with her title or her company. The particular way she rubbed her temple, when a problem exhausted her, the small, private laugh she allowed herself only when she thought no one else could hear it, The fierce loyalty she showed employees the board barely remembered existed. He told her he had hesitated to say anything sooner because the distance between them felt enormous. A CEO and a maintenance supervisor, a woman who ran a company worth billions, and a man who had deliberately chosen the quietest life available to him. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him something she had never said to anyone inside that building before: that money had never once made her feel the way genuine laughter did, that wealth had bought her comfort but never the simple, uncomplicated joy of being fully herself around another person. She confessed that since her father's death, she had built her entire identity around proving she deserved the company bearing her name so thoroughly that she had forgotten what it felt like to want something simply because it made her happy rather than because it made her stronger. Malcolm reached for her hand carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away if this was moving faster than she wanted. And when she did not pull away, something settled quietly between them that neither one needed to name aloud just yet. Over the following weeks, they began seeing each other privately, careful and deliberate, meeting away from the office in small restaurants where neither the board nor the financial press could turn their growing connection into another public spectacle. Malcolm told her, slowly and in fragments over several quiet dinners, about the wife he had lost years earlier, about the sudden illness that had taken her before either of them had time to prepare for a life without the other, and about the long, silent years afterward when he had convinced himself that steady, unremarkable work was the safest way to keep moving forward. Victoria listened, without offering easy comfort or hollow reassurance, understanding instinctively that some grief only needs to be witnessed rather than fixed, and something in the way she simply sat with his sorrow made Malcolm trust her more completely than he had trusted anyone in years. In turn, Victoria opened up about the loneliness of inheriting a company nobody believed she deserved, about board members who called her by her father's name during meetings as though her own identity was interchangeable with his memory, about years of proving herself to people who had already decided the outcome before she walked into the room. She admitted that she had turned down every serious relationship offered to her since taking over the company, suspicious that any man who approached her was drawn more to the Langford name than to the woman carrying it, and that Malcolm's complete indifference toward her wealth had been, from the very beginning, the thing that made her trust him. The merger, freed from the distraction Daniel had engineered, moved forward smoothly, closing successfully within the month and stabilizing the company more thoroughly than it had been in years. One evening, several weeks after the boardroom confrontation, Victoria asked Malcolm to meet her at the office, after hours, telling him only that there was somewhere she wanted to take him. She led him up to the same penthouse level from that very first afternoon, past the same hallway, toward the same bedroom door she had once closed and locked behind them without explanation. This time, she opened the door and gestured for him to enter first, watching his face carefully as old memory and new understanding collided visibly across his features. Once they were both inside, she finally told him the truth she had withheld that first day, the real reason she had brought him to this particular room, rather than simply confronting him downstairs in front of everyone. She explained that this bedroom was the only space in the entire building without any surveillance cameras, a private detail almost nobody outside her closest security team actually knew existed. She told him that when he made his joke in the hallway that afternoon, something in her needed absolute certainty about whether he was mocking her carelessly, the way so many men before him had, or whether some fragment of genuine feeling lived underneath his humor. Bringing him somewhere unrecorded, she admitted, had been her only way of testing whether his words would soften into sincerity once cameras and coworkers were no longer watching, or whether he would simply laugh the whole thing off as nothing. Malcolm laughed quietly at the memory now, recalling how terrified he had been in that exact moment, certain he was walking toward termination rather than the beginning of anything real. They stood together by the same window where she had once told him about the stranger from the coffee shop, both remembering, from entirely different vantage points, how that first ordinary encounter had somehow rippled forward across 5 years to shape the two people now standing quietly beside each other. Victoria reached for his hand again, and this time she pulled him into an embrace, The first time she had allowed herself to hold him without hesitation or calculation, without wondering how the moment might be perceived by anyone else in the building. Malcolm held her back carefully, feeling something settle in his chest that had been missing since long before he ever set foot inside this company. A sense that he had finally been fully seen by someone, rather than simply tolerated or overlooked. After a long, comfortable silence, Victoria stepped back and reached into a small drawer, built discreetly, into the nightstand beside her bed. Retrieving a small velvet box, she had clearly kept hidden there for longer than Malcolm initially realized. She told him she had purchased the ring years earlier, shortly after her father's death, during a period when she had privately promised herself that if she ever found someone who made her laugh the way that stranger once had, she would not waste time waiting for the world's permission to pursue it. She opened the box slowly, revealing a simple, elegant ring, far more understated than anyone might expect from someone of her wealth, and knelt down in front of him without a trace of hesitation. "This time," she said quietly, "I'm the one asking." Malcolm felt his throat tighten as he looked down at her. The woman who had once seemed entirely unreachable now, kneeling before him with a vulnerability she had shown almost no one else in years. He knelt down as well, meeting her at eye level, and told her, voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, that nothing in his entire life, not even his years as an architect designing towers meant to last generations, had ever felt as steady or as certain as this exact moment did. He said yes before she even finished asking, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, laughter and tears arrived together in the same breath. Their wedding took place several months later, on the rooftop terrace of the very building where their story had begun, a simple, unpretentious ceremony that stood in sharp contrast to the extravagant company galas Victoria had hosted throughout her career. She had insisted on keeping the guest list small, favoring the people who had actually known her through the hardest years, rather than the wide circle of investors and society acquaintances who typically filled such events. And Malcolm quietly arranged for a handful of maintenance staff, the people who had known him longest at the company, to sit near the very front, beside Victoria's closest advisors. Strings of warm lights were hung low across the terrace, rather than the towering floral displays Victoria's assistants had originally proposed, and the evening breeze carried away the last traces of the autumn rain that had shadowed the city for so many weeks earlier that year. Employees who had once only known her as the distant, unsmiling CEO gathered that evening and watched, many with genuine tears in their eyes, as she laughed openly beside the man who had once made an entire hallway burst into nervous, disbelieving laughter with a single careless joke. Emily Ross stood near the front with quiet pride, having watched the entire unlikely story unfold from the very beginning, while lower-level employees who had witnessed that original hallway moment now told the story to newer co-workers as though it had become company legend. When Malcolm and Victoria exchanged their vows, neither spoke of mergers or boardrooms, or the wealth that had once stood so heavily between them, choosing instead to speak plainly about laughter, patience, and the strange, quiet gratitude of being fully understood by another person after years of feeling entirely alone inside a crowded room. Daniel Rhodes faced formal criminal charges over the following months. The full extent of his financial misconduct eventually exposed through a thorough independent audit that confirmed every figure Malcolm had presented that day in the boardroom. He resigned from every remaining position he held and eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. His once promising career at the company reduced to a cautionary story employees would quietly reference for years afterward. Victoria, meanwhile, emerged from the entire ordeal with a stronger, more secure position at the head of the company than she had held at any point since her father's death, the board finally treating her with the respect her leadership had earned, rather than the skepticism her gender and inexperience had once invited. Malcolm never accepted the executive position Victoria eventually offered him, choosing instead to remain close to the hands-on work he genuinely loved, while accepting a newly created role as strategic advisor, a position that let him apply his architectural expertise across the company's ongoing renovation projects without abandoning the humility that had defined him throughout his years there. He and Victoria built their marriage on a foundation neither wealth nor title had ever given either of them individually, a partnership rooted instead in mutual respect, quiet trust, and the simple daily reassurance of being fully known by another person without needing to perform for them. On the evening of their first wedding anniversary, the two of them stood together on that same rooftop terrace, watching the city settle into its familiar evening glow as the sun dropped slowly behind the skyline. Malcolm turned to Victoria, with the same easy grin he had once worn in that fateful hallway, and reminded her, half joking just as he had been that very first day, how fortunate it was that she had not simply laughed off his ridiculous proposal and walked away without a second glance. Victoria laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the city lights began flickering on below them one by one. "Good thing you had the courage to say it in the first place," she replied softly. And somewhere below them, inside the quiet, steady building that had once nearly cost them everything, the story of the maintenance chief and the CEO had already become something closer to legend than memory, a reminder to everyone who worked there that sometimes the most ordinary moments, a careless joke in a crowded hallway, carry within them the quiet potential to change an entire life forever.